So welcome to this panel on rent theoretic approaches to property law. I'm delighted that we have Claire Priest here, professor at Yale Law School, who will be moderating the panel today. And we've got a great group of panelists. We've got Faisal Chowdhury from the University of Dayton, who's going to be talking to us about property as rent, the fundamental concept. We've also got Anthony Lee Jang here from University of Chicago Booth School of Business, who's going to be talking to us about a sort of modern update on the property as rent theme, depreciating licenses. We've got Felix Chang, professor at University of Cincinnati Law School, who's going to be talking to us about how to think about trust and estates law from a distributive perspective and how to reform that. We've got Nate Ela, Felix's colleague, also at the University of Cincinnati Law School, who's going to be talking to us about reclaiming the commons in a particular way of handling the rents that are thrown up by property. And then last but not least, we've got Zviko Chatambuka here with us, who's a PhD student at the University of Turin, who's going to be asking the important question whether private property is regressive in its distributive impact. So please take it away, Anthony.
Give me 1 second. Can everyone see this? Great. Okay. So I have 5 to 7 minutes. Did you say?
That's correct.
Great.
And I'll keep time.
Great. Thanks. All right, so first of all, it's really great to be here. Thanks so much, Renzi, for setting this up and inviting me. I'm presenting a paper that so a bit by way of background, I'm at Chicago Booth, and I'm an economist by training and now in a finance department. So this is a market designy paper. It's basically a paper where we're going to propose a new mechanism, which is like a partial property rights mechanism, right? And we're going to do basically an efficiency analysis. So sort of let's kind of write down a set of trade-offs that property rights really navigates through in terms of efficiency, right? Sort of, in what sense is it efficiency improving? In what sense is it efficiency decreasing? And we're going to argue that this depreciating license navigates this kind of trade-off in optimal property rights space more effectively than existing mechanisms. So the kinds of questions we want to analyze here are basically the following, right? You have like classically your 3 factors of production, right? Sort of labor, capital, and land. And land is kind of an interesting one because land, I mean, as the subject of this session, kind of just sits there, right? And nobody sort of owns it ex ante, right? So then a kind of way we think about what you should do with this land is the people, the government takes the land, figures out how to use it most efficiently, and then tries to take whatever revenue is generated by that and sort of divide the benefits between people, right? Now, of course, an economist's approach to this is just sell that stuff, right? Privatize it, sell a use license for this thing in an auction, right? And then presumably something like that is going to make sure it gets to the highest bidder and the revenue you raise can be used to distribute to the people and so on and so forth, right? An interesting question though, is you get a choice when you sell that initial license. How do you sell? How do you design that license governing what the person who buys use rights for this resource can do? So a couple examples of these are, for example, you can sell land use rights, you can sell use rights for radio spectrum, internet domain names, drilling rights. These are all kind of generalized land, right? Sort of it's not created by the product of anyone's labor. It just kind of sits there. And ideally, we want to kind of make sure it's used efficiently and also that sort of people get the benefits of its use. So there's one specific dimension of property rights that we're analyzing here, which is sort of how strict are the property rights? Once you sell this property right to someone, how long do they own the license for, right? And then there's a trade-off we want to highlight in basically the length of the property license that you're selling. The argument for having long-term property rights over what's fundamentally a public resource in the first place is that using many of these resources requires sort of fixed high-cost investments that take a long time to pay off, right? So here's just a picture of sort of farmland in a developing country and a developed country. Farming is very capital intensive, right? After you buy the land, you have to spend a bunch improving it, buying heavy machinery to use it. And the idea is that if you buy a lease on farmland that lasts only, say, sort of a couple months or a year or so, you don't have the incentive to make all these costly investments, right? So an economic argument for why you should have long-term property rights in the first place is they give you incentives for efficient investment. The problem, however, is sell licenses for these that last too long, and you basically create holdout problems. Right? You create these problems that basically sort of people are owning stuff that should be in the hands of someone else. And sort of the Coase theorem fails. So the market is not efficient enough in practice to sort of make sure that at any given point in time, a thing that you sell is in the hands of the most efficient owner. Here's a map of radio spectrum allocation in the US, which is a mess, right? And it's a mess for historical reasons, which is you sell it off band by band, and the market just doesn't repack the spectrum very efficiently. Here is a small property, I think in Toronto, and you can sort of see a similar issue where it's like, in principle, sort of purely economically, there's like a more efficient owner of this property, right? And then so the solution to this problem is if you just sell shorter term property rights, right? You can more frequently just rerun the auctions and reallocate to people who have a higher sort of value for the license, right? However, if you sell shorter term property rights, investment incentives are lower. So we basically want to start with this trade-off between investment and allocative efficiency. Weak property rights discourage investment, which loses that kind of efficiency. Strong property rights sort of give higher investment incentives, but discourage reallocation. When new entrants have a higher value of using these resources, it's difficult to sort of reallocate licenses to them. What we're doing here is proposing a market design, a new mechanism, which is a partial property rights system that sort of, we argue, does a better job of navigating this trade-off than existing mechanisms. And so I can summarize the intuition behind this new property rights system using basically a couple graphs. Here is a depiction of what a perpetual license for an asset is. Here is, give me 1 second. Here is time. Here is your stake in the asset. If you own a perpetual property right over an asset, you own sort of the asset 100% for all of history. Now, if we want to relax property rights by reducing the length of time people own an asset, we might set a term limit. A term limited license is like a license that gives you 100% of an asset for 3 years and nothing thereafter, or whatever the term of the license is. We're proposing a license that does this. So the license smoothly decays over time. And the reason this is arguably better is that rather than your stake in the asset having a sharp cliff where it drops to 0, you have a continuously decaying stake in the asset. And then that means that you have smoother investment incentives. If you want a term limited license and you can make an investment that only pays off here, you have no incentive to do that. You only have incentives to invest if they pay off here and here. Here you have a smoothly decaying set of investment incentives. So even way out in the tail, you have some incentives to invest, right? And then the one last thing I'll end with is basically how exactly do we do this? Using basically a double auction mechanism. So you have a simple mechanism where the license decays by say 15 or 20% a year. And every year when you're trying to sort of, you as the owner of the license have to participate in an auction where you can either sell your 85% of the license to a buyer or participate in the auction to repurchase 15%, the depreciated fraction from the government, right? So you propose this consensual kind of decaying property rights and a simple auction-based, a double auction-based mechanism which basically implements this partial property rights system. So I'll basically leave you with that. We have a bunch of math in the paper basically showing sort of the extent to which this sort of helps to navigate this trade-off between sort of efficient reallocation while also giving people investment incentives. But the goal here is basically to propose this new kind of smoother partial property rights mechanism, which has some nice properties that sort of, is that me or no? Which existing partial property rights systems don't have. Okay, so that is it. Thanks a lot. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Anthony.
So I we're going to go through all 5 papers and then have the Q&A.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll go to Q&A after that. So it sounds like Faisal's may have been resolved.
I think
yes.
so. Let me just try.
Yes, he speaks.
Share my screen.
Excellent.
Thank you in the meantime, Anthony, for taking that over. Okay, so okay, so sorry, this appears not to be letting me share my slides now. I guess I can do it without the slides, or I would have to switch browsers again. I'm not sure.
Faisal, if you want to shoot me your slides, I should be able to share them for you. Although you'll have to tell me when to switch from side to side.
Okay. I probably would need a couple of minutes to email them to you or something then. So it might be better to have somebody else go and try to.
Okay, that should be fine.
I'm happy to go. I'm happy to go, Ramsey.
Okay, great. Felix, go ahead.
Okay, let me try this to make sure I can share my slides. Okay, can everyone see this? I think so, right? Okay, all right. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks to Ramsey for organizing this, and to Claire for serving as our commentator. It's a real privilege to be here and to see old friends and to meet new ones. So my paper articulates a framework for prioritizing certain goals for reforms within trusts and estates. Here, scholars are really getting more and more worried about inequality. Okay, back to my prezi. So to set the stage, here's a taxonomy, my taxonomy of reform proposals in recent years in trust and estates. In 1990, Mark Asher proposes this really harshest cheat rule where a decedent's property is going to be sold and proceeds turned over to the government upon death, with really very few exceptions. His normative underpinning wasn't so much to tackle wealth inequality as it was that it's just plain unfair to have so much dead hand control and to have one's station in life determined by the luck of the family that they're born into. Now, in recent years, you have more and more scholars engaging not only with inequality, but also more with economic analysis. So here's a laundry list of them. It's taken a really long time for trust and estates to get here, and that's for a number of reasons. Trust and estates was always thought to be comprised of really discrete rules that revolve around a small number of players, for instance, family members and estate fiduciaries. And economic analysis has really revolved around these small players and taken more of a microeconomic perspective. The other thing is that trust and estates as a field is really rulesy. And you have longstanding critiques from people like Louis Kaplow and Stephen Chavell that say that the tax system, rather than rules themselves, are the best place to redress inequality. So we have a slew of reform proposals now, particularly after 2016, where with economic inequality, we saw that it could foment political instability. So I kind of categorize reforms as follows. So reforms that are targeting the ultra high end, ultra wealthy families where estate taxes are pretty weak and the rule against perpetuities is getting weaker. And then at the other end, we've got reforms targeting low income households. And there, reforms to intestacy is going to be most prominent. So I think that trust and estates just is a perfectly apt place to push back against inequality. But to do so, we have to think about what inequality is. And so my argument then for the animating principle is that trust and estates should advance intergenerational economic mobility. That is the ability of children to move beyond the economic station of their parents. So let me take you through some of the foundations for this argument. The first pillar is the work of Miles Korak, an economist who've looked into intergenerational economic mobility. And they found that inequality can be really sticky across generations. So this is what's become known as the Great Gatsby curve from Korak, where it says that intergenerational economic mobility, or this elasticity between parental earnings and a child's adult earnings, You see here measured against the Gini coefficient is an expression of inequality. So to me, I think that intergenerational economic mobility should be the central concern for trust and estates reforms. Is a field, trust and estates is concerned about the gratuitous transmission of wealth, and often across generations, and where perpetual trusts are concerned, oftentimes across multiple generations. So those transmissions of wealth are often where income inequality within one generation gets locked into as wealth inequality across multiple generations. And I tend to think of trust and estates as this complement to the laws around the generation of wealth. So like business law, where there's a lot that's wrong about, antitrust law, as this conference examines, corporate law, financial regulation, and labor laws. It really allows ultra-rich households to earn so much more than everyone else. And I think that trust and estates is probably the last bulwark to arrest the velocity of income inequality before it compounds as wealth inequality upon inheritance. So if we're mindful of intergenerational economic mobility as our organizational principle, then we can work through some quandaries that might arise as we think through the reforms for trust and estates. So let me begin at the high end of really ultra wealthy, high income families. So let me use perpetual or dynasty trusts as an example. So dynasty trusts really owe their existence to this onslaught against the rule against perpetuities that happened in 1986 with these amendments to the GST tax. It allows for trusts to be exempt from GST taxes, but fails to impose this time limit on duration of these trusts and leaves their duration really to the vagaries of the state laws on the rule against perpetuities. So it's this combination of this growing exemption amount to GST taxes and this near abolition of the rule against perpetuities over time. That means that grantors with really dynastic aspirations can settle trusts in any number of states and forever dodge estate taxes. This slide here shows the increase in this unified estate gift and generation skipping transfer tax exemption over time, as well as the dwindling of the top tax rate. I'm happy to talk more about at the very high end reforms at Q&A, but I think that if you prioritize intergenerational economic mobility, what will end up happening is that as you curtail perpetual trust, we might have to tolerate some sort of inequality in the short run. For instance, if you've got high earners that might divert their assets to spending or to investments, that might further inequality in the short run. But so long as you get kind of this over the long run mean regression of incomes and wealth toward the mean, I think that that's something that we should be comfortable with tolerating, but something that we're forced to confront if we're to identify what exactly we mean by inequality and redresses to inequality. So maybe in my remaining time, I can talk quickly about maybe at the bottom end what prioritizing intergenerational economic mobility might look like. So I guess this is the pillar that's resting on the work of economists who've traced the splintering of family compositions along economic lines over the decades. So a lot of this is driven by the work of Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, but here the figures I'm taking are from Shelley Lundberg. So the past quarter century has witnessed declines in both marriage rates and divorce rates across the US, and that's kind of a paradox. So the reason is because for really high income households, you've got things like technological improvements that are making home care easier, delays in childbirth, higher educational attainment among women, and that's begun to close the gendered wage gap somewhat. So marriage is now, we're finding it's binding couples who are more on similar economic footing and sharing similar interests. What does the picture look like among lower economic households? Marriage is becoming really infrequent, and it's really being replaced by cohabitation. So you've got now this bimodal distribution where marriage is restricted to couples that are more similar than different, and ensuing marriages are more stable. So it's interestingly, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see, but it's interestingly also this bimodal distribution. 1 minute. Okay, so I'll end here, but interestingly, you see this bimodal distribution that characterizes the instruments of trust and states as well. on one hand, you've got trust and non-probate instruments that cater to like the privacy desires and dynastic aspirations of the hyper wealthy. And on the other hand, you've got intestacy in the probate system that serves low-income households really terribly and really throwing intrafamilial conflicts into public view. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Felix. That was great. So it looks like we've got our technical difficulties partly solved and partly sort of Rube Goldberged. So Faisal, please take it away, and I will share your slides now, and just let me know when you want me to switch to another slide.
Okay, Ramsey, I think I've actually figured everything out. I'm about to share my screen, and my mic appears to
Okay.
be. So I think you should be able to see that.
Okay.
Okay,
We'll
great.
go for it.
Okay, so I'll just handle it. So sorry about those difficulties. And again, thank you, Felix, now as well, for shouldering that burden. So let me just start by saying thanks to Ramsey and everyone at UK for the invitation and really for organizing what feels like and has been a really impressive and extremely well thought out program, I think, really excellent. Let me also note that I'm not going to be talking about the internet, but will very much be talking about distribution and rent and rentierism. Although for the purposes of my talk, I've had to mostly excise the discussion in my paper about property theory. Before starting, I'll also point out that in terms of my larger interests beyond contemporary questions of law and distributional analysis and larger historical questions, I'm interested, and this paper is very much part of an interesting way, in ways that concepts of property rights have been worked out in legal versus economic thought going back to the dawn of the early modern era, including and especially as connected to questions of modernity and empire. Okay. So with that, I think a point of special interest for me is, as far as the history of ideas goes, is in how the abstraction of the right to property was grounded through its identification with land, as Ramsey had mentioned this morning, and how in turn property was long dogged by the shadow of its potential identification with rent, meaning its identification as a legalized means of extracting unearned revenue amounting to a kind of scarcity premium or a toll booth-like charge from what is ultimately, in the land's case, an unproduced resource. This identity between property and rent has plainly distributional implications that have inspired a long pedigree of intellectual concern in law and economics, although in our own day, I think it has remained rather obscured. On the one side, it's been tended to be veiled somewhat by the discourse of new institutional economics with its fixation on property rights institutions as the key to economic development. From another side, one might say it's been veiled by public choice theory and its new political economy, which fixates on a notion of rent seeking that I think is somewhat attenuated in its, or has been attenuated in its distributional bite, at least as compared to the concept of rent as it animated classical political economy going back at least to the 17th century. Now, jumping to the present day empirical case study that I want to highlight in my time today, it invites us to consider the ongoing centrality of land rent to the distribution of value in our economy, especially to the upward redistribution of value into and then among the ranks of the fire insurance and real estate sector in the age of financialization, or as some identify it, late capitalism. Plainly, as this slide about the lead up to the 2007 crisis from economist Michael Hudson suggests, real estate interest has played an absolutely pivotal role in the American economy. As you look at it, let me just highlight three other important features of the political economy of real estate. First, it's the biggest asset class in almost every economy, including that of the US. Today, as Samuel Stein estimates in his recently published book, Capital City, an amazing 61% of global assets are locked up in real estate. Second, and related, credit creation in our economy crucially depends on how much banks, in a sense, make real estate worth by lending against it. And third, credit created through real estate lending becomes a basis for redirecting earned income into various other kinds of financial asset property. The question I think this precipitates for us is about how much real estate-based financial flows really comprise a flow of land rent as distinct from remuneration for real estate entrepreneurialism. The more specific context in which I invite us to think about this question is connected In my paper, To the Rise of a New Form of Real Estate Securitization That Has Emerged in the Wake of the Great Recession, as large institutional investors started vacuuming up single-family homes left over from the last financial crisis, in less than a decade, so-called Wall Street landlords have thus silently transformed the American housing economy, paving the way for what the New York Times recently called a, quote, housing recovery without a homeowner recovery. Importantly, this was just the top layer of change. As this next slide depicts, the first so-called single-family rental-backed securitization product was assembled from these Wall Street-owned homes in 2013. So my paper invites us to use this new type of real estate securitization as a prompt to more critically think about what we can call debt-based financial asset property and rent, and for trying to find ways to take stock of how central land's site value, based as it is on the scarcity of high-quality public goods-rich locations, has remained to the seeming value that's generated through the residential real estate economy. Considering this challenge, in the paper I draw on data from the housing economist Morris Davis to separate home price values into a cost of built structures and a price of land. To do so, Davis and his co-authors subtract the explicitly determinable replacement costs of structures after accounting for depreciation from overall home price values in order to indirectly infer the land price component. Overall, what the figures I prepared from the data show is that much and even most of the increasing value of residential real estate in the post-war era has really consisted of payment to service scarcity charges associated with the land price component of total home price values in the market. This is clear from this first figure from my paper, which shows the data for the US as a whole from 1930 to 2000, and which I've adjusted to real year $2,000 and indexed to 1930. As you can see from the ascent of the red line for total home price values, it only started in the early 1970s, and it was the land price value component in blue that was the key driver. Structure cost increases in green were much more modest. In this second and last figure I'll show from the paper, you see the share of the land price component for 6 states that I've selected from other of Davis's data. While more volatile overall, it is consistent with aggregate national data. The gray and brown lines for New York and California, I think, are particularly striking. Something that's not fully depicted in these graphs that I want to point out in coming to my close is that the land price values share in aggregate national home price values doubled from 20 to 40% between 1975 and 1990. That increase of 20 percentage points compares to only a 10-point increase from 1996 to 2006. So in other words, in this respect at least, the last housing bubble was not quite unique in history, as the United States' leading housing economist, Yale's Robert Shiller, famously put it. Instead, since the 1970s, it has been a staple of the US economy to redirect productive income to the real estate and related parts of the financial sector. And with real estate in specific, as the last couple of slides show, this has directed cash flow especially to bidding up land scarcity value. In terms of policy implications, putting aside historic illusions, one could elaborate with reference to Henry George's single tax proposal of the late 19th century and earlier Ricardian socialist ideas about taxing away the quote-unquote unearned increment of rent. This last question demands, I think, that we ask one other. What would happen if we refused to allow real estate developers and bondholders to legally extract rentiers premiums from the scarcity of high-value land sites? In turn, how much might such a refusal impact real estate's role as plausible security for credit creation, and hence impact the power of the banking and shadow banking sectors more generally?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Faisal, for that fascinating presentation. So may I suggest that we move on now to Nate's presentation?
Sure. Okay, so screen shared. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks especially to Ramsey for the invitation to be part of this exciting conference. I'll just say briefly where the chapter that I shared fits into a broader book project, and then summarize quickly the argument of the chapter. So this is the first chapter of a book manuscript that aims to explain why urban farming has repeatedly emerged during moments of social and economic crisis in US cities, and why this particular land use has never actually become a permanent part of the physical or legal landscape of our cities. And in getting started with this research, I realized that lots of people, myself included, often thought of urban farms and gardens as a way to reclaim the commons or to bring about an urban commons. As I described in this chapter, this practice of describing it this way ranged from radical urban geographers to legal scholars interested in governing the city as a commons, to landscape architects, urban planners, and public health scholars, and even sometimes to the gardeners themselves who I was spending time with as part of the ethnographic part of my research. But the more that I thought about it, it seemed kind of weird to fit this social practice into the box of the commons. For one thing, if you take the definition that Eleanor Ostrom and others have developed of common pool resources, urban land doesn't really fit. It may be rivalrous, but it's also excludable in a way that something like a fishery is not. And from another angle, you could think of the commons as a set of customary rights that determined how non-owners could use land before enclosure in Europe. And some people have argued that urban agriculture relates in some way to the commons in that sense, despite the fact that commoning back then usually wasn't about growing crops, but instead about things like grazing or gathering wood. So what then was the lineage, if any, that you could actually draw to connect the commons way back then to the urban growing these days that some people say represents reclaiming the commons? I try to figure that out in this chapter, and here's what I suggest is going on. So the story starts back in 1649 with Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers, who invaded some common land that had been enclosed southwest of London and set up a collective garden. They justified this in terms of natural rights, arguing that the poor had a right to reclaim common lands for growing food. And though they were put off the land pretty quickly, their ideas spread in the centuries since through the manifestos that they published. This essentially previewed the problem that John Locke would state in his treatise a few decades later. What do we do when everything is enclosed and some people are left without any property? Locke, of course, suggested that what's left unused should revert to the commons, which I've actually heard a grower in Chicago cite as justification for trespassing and setting up a garden on a vacant lot. I suggest that Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine basically proposed two different solutions to Locke's problem. Jefferson, for his part, in a 1785 letter to James Madison, written from France, suggested that the point of enclosure was to encourage production, but if we don't take care to create other employment for people who haven't been able to appropriate private property, then the right to labor the earth should return to the unemployed. One solution that Jefferson thought about was to let the unemployed simply use any idle land that they could find at a moderate rent. Although with its open frontier, Jefferson noted that this solution probably wouldn't be necessary in the US anytime soon. Paine, for his part, saw that this sort of redistribution would be totally impractical. A decade later, in Agrarian Justice, Paine proposed simply taxing the land, levying a ground rent, and transferring the proceeds. I call these instincts the property fix, adjusting who can use property or what it means to own it, and the tax fix, which today is often how we think about redistribution as functioning and how social supports are funded. So the chapter traces this dual instinct, the tax fix and the property fix, through the projects of social reformers in the 1800s. One of them is Arthur Young, the conservative British agrarian reformer who proposed supporting the poor in England by letting them cultivate wastelands, or you might say, making them cultivate wastelands. Another is Henry George, who we've heard about already, the great American champion of the single tax on land value. And then there's Peter Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist prince and geographer, who it turns out was a big fan of using farms and gardens to support the urban poor. Kropotkin actually ties into my Chicago story, which is the larger part of the book, because in 1901, he visited the Hull House Social Settlement to give a talk about his recently released book on the subject, Fields, Factories, and Workshops. around the time when Hull House residents were getting involved in the process of matching landless gardeners with unused land around the city. In effect, what I'm saying here is that there's a dual lineage, responding to enduring problems posed by private property through either a tax fix or a property fix. And so to wrap up, I'll briefly explain the distinction. Tax fix refers to what most of us usually think of as welfare, funded through tax and transfer, ranging from income assistance to social services to asset-based welfare. Property fix, on the other hand, means redistributing by reallocating property rights to a resource. Most familiar here is what we often think of as land reform, a transfer of the full ownership rights, the full bundle of sticks to a resource. Here, what I'm interested in is a different type of property fix, which I call the use fix. Achieving a redistribution not by transferring the full bundle of sticks of ownership, but instead simply rights to use and benefit from a resource. And so this chapter then is part rethinking and critiquing the notion that urban agriculture actually reclaims the commons, but it's also mapping out a new conceptual terrain on which to build an explanation for how and why people have repeatedly tried to bring about a use fix in a major American city. And that's the project for the rest of the book. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Nate. Now moving last but not least to Zviko, who will be presenting on the question whether marginalist private property is regressive. Zviko, please take it away. Let's see, we seem to be encountering some technical difficulties here. Zviko, are you there? Okay, well, why don't we, while Zviko's trying to get back online. Zviko, are you there? Zviko, can you hear me? Okay, so while while we try to work on Zviko's connection, I think it might be best to start off with a little bit of our conversation, and then once we've got Zviko online again, we can pause and have his presentation. Zviko, are you there? Are you with us on audio? Okay, so let's go. Yes, Zviko?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Well, excellent. Well, so.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, if please.
Just as I was about
it sounds like your audio is good.
Sure what that was.
So we can't see you, but we can hear you. So would you like to begin your presentation?
Oh, thank you very much, Ramsey. Good evening, and thank you everybody for having me here. In the paper that I wish to present, I intend to assess a quasi and commodity vision of property that is associated with productive efficiency and sometimes with allocative efficiency. And I make 4 main points in doing this. The first point I make is that private property is inherently regressive. Secondly, that private property is ultimately inefficient. The third point I would wish to make is that regressivity creates a propertied class that can come to dominate political and economic systems, worsening regressivity and inefficiency. And finally, that the internet age has exacerbated all these 3 effects. I make 2 related arguments to assert that private property, at least in a commodity vision, as it were, is inherently regressive. The first argument is that the declining marginal utility of income means that money has lower utility in a wealthy person's valuation, and so they have a higher valuation for property than a poorer person. And for similar reasons, a poorer person is more likely to sell property they have in order to obtain money, for example, for basics. So the basic point here is that private property transactions are just more likely to move productive property from the poor to the wealthy. And that's a function of the declining marginal utility of income. The second point, closely related, of course, is that property gives its owner monopoly power, creating allocative inefficiency, since the owner can hold out for excessive prices. Now, this exacerbates the regressive effects of declining marginal utility of income, since the wealth will have greater monopoly power and so are more likely to capture most of the gains from any trade, as it were. Now, these related factors connote an inherently regressive effect within private property's bargaining framework. The second point is that general private property is ultimately inefficient. For the reasons set out above, private property's allocative tendency is essentially to direct resources to other resources and not necessarily to their most productive use. Now, the point that has already been made, I mean, I've already mentioned, of course, that private property gives its owner monopoly power, and that's already a cause of allocative inefficiency in the system. But a private property allocation system driven by the wealth gap rather than productive use develops a feedback loop with regressivity, making private property increasingly less productively efficient as well, since most transactions, or at least as inequality increases, transactions are increasingly driven more by the wealth gap than by productive efficiency, as it were. So that feedback effect makes unconstrained private property ultimately unstable. That's at the end of the day, the key point that I would want to make here. The next issue is that the regressivity of private property exacerbates socioeconomic cleavages in the political system by disproportionately strengthening the hand of the wealthy. Distribution in the political system becomes very difficult to obtain. And this is significant, especially because the dominant view in the law and economics tradition is that private law ought to deal with efficiency only, while distributional issues should be addressed through the tax and transfer system. So distributional issues are shifted essentially to the hardcore political system, the very system which is then undermined by the regressive effects of private property. With regressivity baked in, the risk of increased and successful rent seeking by the wealthy heightens both the regressivity and inefficiency. And finally, I'll address the issue relating to the internet age. The internet age has had effects, obviously, major effects productively, but also it has worsened regressivity in a lot of ways. Data-driven commerce has allowed internet giants to squeeze out much of the consumer surplus in transactions. And of course, at a broader level, internet monopolies are more easily actively squeezing out talented competition and disrupting entrepreneurship purely due to their first mover advantage, first mover economic power, or shall we call it that. And of course, there is the question of political control by internet giants, which is giving rise to inefficiencies and regressivity due to monopoly power and rent seeking. So my conclusion in this is that a commodity vision of private property is inherently regressive and ultimately inefficient and unstable from both an economic and a political perspective. Further, that essentially, that some level of redistribution, or of distribution rather, is a necessity to be able to stabilize private property as a system. Thank you very much. That is the summary of the paper.
Well, I guess, should I just take it from here, Ramsey?
Yes, so Claire, please take it away. And to the audience, unfortunately, we can't have everybody sort of up on video as much as that would be nice due to some of the limitations in this system. But you're invited to participate in the conversation through the chat. So please, questions, comments, put them in there, and at the end of the session, we'll do our best to get to them. Okay, thanks, Claire. Take it away.
518, and so I'll present everybody with a question, and maybe we can, it seems like we're gonna have to sort of do this fast and then to get to some Q&A for the remaining at least 15 minutes or so. I would love to make one little plug, which is that after working for God knows how many years, I came out with a book recently, and I just wanted to say I have a podcast episode that on my work that I don't want people to buy the book, but if you are interested in a history of property rights in colonial U.S., there's a podcast that I've done recently. But let me turn to these wonderful papers. Thank you so much for including me in the conference and for allowing me the opportunity to respond to the papers. I've never responded to 5 at once, so this is a new challenge, but I'll just go rapid fire through the papers in the order that they were presented. So Anthony, my question for you, I thought that this was really interesting. And I guess my question is just that whether, first of all, I didn't understand your claim about how strong property rights discouraged reallocation. That seemed to be, it's not the property rights themselves that's discouraging, it's how they're structured, so that if you actually have a 10-year lease on a building, but if you can sublease it, then you're not discouraging reallocation. It's about how these licenses, if they're not allowed to be assignable. So maybe one potential solution to your problem is just like the assignability of the licenses would deal with the productive with the reallocation issue. But I guess another question I have is that, to what extent should your policy proposal be sensitive to fixed costs? So with regulated industries, the companies go in and they have to actually pitch, make a statement about the kind of fixed costs. Because it seems, are you saying that were you sort of doing a one-size-fits-all approach, or should someone who's getting a license have to demonstrate some sort of fixed costs and get it on the basis of that, just as a way to initially. So those were just some thoughts on your policy, which I actually thought that was very interesting. Felix, so I really, this was very interesting about all these different trust and estates reform proposals, and how to deal with the question of inequality and inheritance. I guess one area I thought I wanted a little more explanation was just the problem that you were presenting with low-income people and the question of intestacy. Because I back in my law school years took trust and estates from John Langbein, who was one of the authors of the model uniform probate code. Where they're really trying to sort of stay up to date with family structure, modern day family structures, stepchildren, multiple marriages, and, trying to balance like a whole different set of issues. So I think the intestacy doctrines are really trying to balancing the rights between surviving spouses and children and the like. And I'm wondering whether your specific example is something that Thomas Mitchell has drawn so much attention to, which is the excessive partition of family property in especially in African-American households. But I just wanted some more sort of specificity about that, because the big problem with low-income families is just there's not the property there to distribute. But I didn't really see how the probate system was to. It seemed like it didn't really fit in with your main argument, which is really focusing on the sort of super wealthy and what we should do about inheritance reform in a new era. The question of low income and their interface with the probate system seems to represent a whole different set of issues, and maybe the system's just too costly institutionally, just that it's inefficient and needs updating. Maybe we should be able to move to the government should actually offer resources for all of this to be done more cheaply through doing maybe setting up some online, I don't know, other systems. But I felt I was just a little bit unclear in your presentation about that issue. With regard to Faisal, I guess, I mean, one question I had on your paper was how much you want to point to things like zoning, because I know that as a big problem, because so you identify the central problem as land scarcity, but of course we can always build upward. So it's not actually simply that we don't have enough land out there in the world. So what are the causes of the land scarcity? And it strikes me that one of the big problems is zoning and the way that property owners are able to commandeer the development process and block affordable housing. I mean, I live in one of these ridiculous neighborhoods that was zoned in a different century, and it doesn't really fit anyone's interests or needs at the moment. And it's very, I think zoning in general has been so instead of how much is that a problem? And I guess and one more sort of existential question is what you think of ownership. Do we want an ownership economy? I mean, I feels like for back in the from the 80s through the 2000s, there was this whole pushing with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to push people into ownership, and that ended up being part of what led to 2008 as well, was this government kind of emphasis on home ownership. Ownership has the benefit of letting people have equity in the property that they can benefit from, but it also means they're incurring a lot of risk, which by renting, you're eliminating certain risks. So that was just a deeper question is, how should we think of ownership in this new post 2008 world? And should it be a goal anymore? I'd love you to answer that one for me, because I struggle with that myself. So Nate, I found this history really interesting because it's like the period that I'm working in, and I learned so much. And I from what I've read, like a lot of that was just completely new to me. The diggers, so much of what you're bringing out, I think is just like completely fascinating history. And for you, I just wanted to, I'm not sure if you're aware of Greg Oblofsky's book that's coming out. He writes about, he's writing a history of the founding from the perspective of the Northwest Territory and the Southwest Territory, which is like modern day Tennessee. And he goes through the way that the federal government actually went through process like the land claims of everyone from 5 or 6 different Native American nations to white settlers, to French habitants, to land companies. And it's this incredibly detailed account of all of the different land claims at that time. And I think it would really help if you're looking at that period at this point, I think with kind of contending with a lot of the things that he has uncovered, partly because I can tell you that it like informed my view of a lot of the settlers and things. So when we look at somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who's now got this vision of the yeoman farmer out settling, and there's these redistributed aspects to it. Now that Greg's book offers all this information, we can really bring in the relationships with the native tribes, and it's this wonderful resource for really getting at a lot of the complexities at the time of how people were thinking of settlement in the territories and that sort of thing. So I just thought that would be a great resource. But otherwise, I thought that this history and that this idea of the use fix is really interesting. I know that the English also had, when they were, even with they would chartered companies, they had this thing with sort of cultivating wastelands that had this public policy aspect. So I know that one of the precedents for some of the colonial charters was actually when you chartered a company in England and you said you were going to cultivate wasteland, you would actually get, I don't know if you're aware of this, like this, you would get something close to the feast, you would get it free of all the feudal trappings. And so it's sort of interesting how there's also this, that to stimulate productive use, the crown is granting these properties with a different kind of title, and that's sort of interesting too. It's like the way that feudalism is sort of falling away through all of this. So I thought that would just be another point to bring up. But I loved I can't wait to read more of this. And then Zviko, this is really interesting. I guess what I would want to ask you, because I think that what you're saying is true, that private property it's inherently regressive. I mean, I think that there's, you know, I agree with your contentions, and then I guess the question is, if everyone's better off with this system. I mean, if you look at something like, you know, there's such a big literature on property rights and say wealth throughout the world. So society, you know, even something like James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu's Why Nations Fail, and private property is one of the things that leads to a overall wealthier society where even the poor are actually better off, even though, yes, you get extreme inequality and the like. Is that, I mean, does that matter? Or is it just the inequality that we're attacking? Or if it led to poor people even having greater wealth just due to the broader effects on the society? Because I think it's fairly indisputable that countries that have had enforcement of private property rights have been ones that generate wealth. And part of what you're saying, because you said that, well, private property is inefficient, it doesn't lead to the most productive use, but I guess you have to ask if it's not, one of the things it does is it gives decentralized control over these decisions to the property owners. And the question is, in contrast, who else would be the decision maker about productivity? Like, how else would you, so do you see a better path where these decisions could be made? So it's, instead of just this happening in this decentralized marketplace, which of course does lead to inequality and these problems that you're pointing out, but it sort of is a centralized mechanism for making these decisions gonna make the people you're concerned about better off. So that was sort of my question for you. So I will leave it there and look forward to anybody who wants to.
Should we just go in order? I can maybe respond quickly to Claire's. Okay, great. So just take a bit of time to respond. Thanks a lot, Claire, for the really great comments. So just responding. So you basically had two comments, one about fixed cost, if I remember, and the first was on where is the inefficiency from private property? And that's a really great question. I think my defense is largely empirical. That sort of, there's a number in sort of various fields of empirical studies that suggest that secondary markets, both resale markets and leasing markets, are not perfectly efficient. So then there's some evidence, I think, in even emissions permit markets, where you would think basically that sort of it's such a sort of liquid homogeneous good that there should be a thick market. Well, I think for pollutant emission permits in the US, I think sulfur dioxide, there's some evidence that basically sort of there were pretty large frictions in resale markets, right? And then I think sort of spectrum is another area where you would expect sort of, even if the resale market is not very efficient, you could easily sort of imagine a rental market where you just rent blocks of spectrum from the large owners. And sort of, despite some economists, basically, there's a letter to the FCC where a number of economists who designed the spectrum auctions basically said, design the auctions and let the markets work out the rental agreements. And sort of the markets did effectively. So then the sort of resale and rental market for spectrum is still pretty liquid. So empirically, it seems that sort of the Coase theorem kind of applies in both cases, sort of both in secondary sale and secondary rental markets. Efficiency is just sort of these markets aren't able to reach fully efficient outcomes. That's kind of, this empirical observation is what motivates the work really. And sort of there's theoretical reasons you can model asymmetric information, bargaining frictions and such that back that, but sort of that's both really the theory and empirics giving that. Sorry, and the fixed costs, sorry, could you remind me I wrote down fixed costs and I sort of lost the exact thrust of the argument there.
Oh, I was just wondering whether there should be should the government consider fixed costs, the extent of fixed costs when they're making a decision about the time duration.
Yeah. So yes, exactly. And I think the way we're thinking about this is depreciating licenses are a partial property right system with a tuning parameter. And so the tuning parameter is the depreciation rate. And sort of it's a nice mechanism because you can pick that to make a DL basically sort of full private property or a really short-term rental contract. And so if you can continuously adjust to these kinds of factors, if there's fixed transaction costs that you want to kind of discourage turnover, you just set the depreciation rate really low. So it's basically like almost a full property rights license, right? And then if you want high turnover, you just set that higher. And sort of it's really similar to setting the term on a term limit license, except rather than saying you own this thing for 5 years and nothing thereafter, and then adjust the term of that thing, you say you own this thing at a rate that sort of decays sort of smoothly, and you change the rate at which it decays. So it's a market design innovation in that sense, where you sort of still pick a tuning parameter, but you tune sort of in a more smooth way where you avoid this sharp cliff and you have this like smooth decay instead. That sort of addresses that. Thanks a lot for the comments.
I think I'm next, Claire. Thanks so much for those comments. I think that for low-income households, that's the part where the proposals, I think, are probably, they just don't have as much meat on them because I think that they're just not as like distributively efficient. So if you think about high-income families, you know, with the estate tax, it abuts the tax system, and there's just a lot more that you could do. But you're right, with low-income households, the assets just aren't there. Some of the reforms that property law scholars and trust and estates law scholars have proposed are things like really, right, just to prevent the fractioning of shares. So ways to do that might be, instead of an intestacy, maybe everything is split among distant family. Maybe you look at non-probate instruments to see if there are preferences that are voiced by the decedent, and so maybe you honor those preferences. And I think that the system does have its flaws, but maybe there are ways in which low-income households can opt out of parts of the systems. For instance, other people have proposed not assessing property taxes as harshly or having like a 2-year stay. And the last thing I'll say is this is kind of a false dichotomy that I just articulated as a way of getting us thinking about this, because I mean, trust in the state's instruments are really complex. And I think there are a whole host of instruments that are at the middle that middle income households will use, like non-probate instruments like insurance, 401k plans, or intra vivos trusts. So I just think that starting off by thinking about where it makes the most difference, maybe at the really high and really low ends, helps us to think about the way forward. But thanks very much. That was really helpful.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, I was second or third. Thanks, really excellent job on bringing together all these different papers and so quickly and cogently. It's like a very difficult task. The first question about zoning, this is a question I think Ramsey raised in the chat as well. And I think it also connects to the issue of infrastructure and public goods investments that was raised in the chat as well by, is it Dan? Maybe somebody raised it there. But yeah, the issue is not so much scarcity of land as such, but scarcity of sites. And thinking about site scarcity necessarily requires that we think about this whole matrix of policies, from zoning to lack of public investment, that render sites, valuable sites, scarce. Of course, you can do that in the narrow sense and in the broader sense. I mean, there has to be a reason for, besides provisioning places with public infrastructure, public transport, and actually being able to build more, you'd also need a reason for people to go to places you're building. And obviously there's a chicken and egg question there, but clearly the mobility around America's economic geography is much less than we are probably accustomed to thinking, like so many other aspects of mobility. So I think all of those things are on the table. I guess my focus in the paper, though, is sort of going back to the question of the conference, is that it does feel striking how much of our contemporary economy is still not just a rentierist economy, but an economy based on land-based rentierism, which is interesting, thinking back to the way that Ramsey was framing things this morning, when we were talking about Professor Hovenkamp's idea of sort of the realists as being the first generation of legal economists. They're kind of doing the classical economic thinkers one better by expanding the Ricardian analysis of rent beyond just land. But in a sense, we don't, a big part of what plagues us is we don't even need that early 20th century analysis to think about what's going on if we start seriously grappling with how much surplus is still being extracted through rentierist mechanisms in our land economy. So I think that's quite striking. I guess on your last question of ownership, yeah, obviously it's the $10 million question, and it's grown more complex now given our housing sector recovery, but not a home ownership sector recovery. So it's a little bit like, be careful what you wish for. I guess it brings to mind two things. One thing it brings to mind for me is it's a bit like when people point out that at the beginning of the 20th century, nobody would have really guessed that what banks would be doing is in effect becoming the central planners for mixed capitalist economies. So and mortgage banking, real estate banking is at the center of this, obviously, and has been for much of the 20th century. But there's something striking about thinking about how much of our economy is, in essence, centrally planned through Wall Street, through the banking and shadow banking sector. So home ownership is at the center of that whole process. And if we jump back a century ago, nobody would have really imagined that should be the case, or that made any sense as the best way to distribute and reallocate capital. The other thing it makes me think of is the recent talk about, over the last few years, of California exporting its housing crisis around the country. People might have seen this article in the Times a few days ago that was quite striking about what's going on in Idaho and what's happening with house prices in Idaho because of the egress of Californians there, and just again creating this dynamic in cities around the country, Boise, Nashville, everywhere, where the house price economy for those who can afford it at the upper end of the stratified spectrum is wreaking havoc on the rental economy, and of course, perfectly well connected to our homelessness crisis, insofar as study after study makes pretty clear that the homelessness crisis is organized around that tipping point when people can't rent without spending more than a third of their income on it. You very clearly in all these places, whether on the coast or elsewhere, start seeing an increase in homelessness. So that poisonous dynamic between home ownership and renting and financialization is hard to unpack. But yeah, all that's raised, I think, by home ownership.
Great, thank you so much.
I'll just save time for a Q&A for the audience, and say thank you. I mean, since my focus has largely been, on Chicago post 1893, and after the closing of the frontier, it's really helpful to have leads to follow about practices that were going on before. So thank you.
Vico, are you?
Thank you very much for.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. We can.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions and your comments. So as a starting position, I was hoping, at least my position was a query of private property movement. Broadway to private property. So I didn't take that point. Now, I think one of the issues that I speak to was the fourth part, essentially what I could call the fourth point that I was making, which relates to changes for a new era. So with issues like the internet age and to some degree, size of financial entities, things like this, maybe, for example, means of regulation have to be devised beyond standard. And in a way, I'm thinking in terms of, for example, common property regime for farming in a small enclosed village could be quite effective, quite efficient. Private property, commodity private property, work fairly well in a world where growth is powered by physical resources, by, in this type of. In the internet age, maybe we have to do something different. That's generally what I was hoping to point to that's with some changes, perhaps the structure of property will have to change. We have to think of new things. And I was in some ways, although certainly I engage at the level that I would have hoped, by Anthony's paper and Whale as well, of how property could be reconfigured for a new age. So in a lot of ways, the critique was hopefully going to go there, and certainly these are things that I have to think about. But yes, so an additional concern perhaps linked to that, the question of decentralized control. This is close to a question I had, to something I wondered about the nature of democracy, what property, as it were. And again, there's this image, I think this is perhaps a bit more common in libertarian strains of thought, I could be wrong here, where property is definitely very closely aligned to democracy. Now, when that vision of private property, the new internet age, appears to put a lot of political power to the hands of, for example, internet monopolies, perhaps in this particular age, that particular vision of private is no longer fit, as it were. So that's where I was hoping. Definitely, it means in the final analysis, there's certain around that question that I'm going to have to do. And thank you for directing me to that essential question. And I'll hope to, think more about that and
well, I look forward
work out
to
some solutions which are much more solid.
the work you're engaged in this project. It's very important. So thank you, everyone. So I guess I'm, as the moderator, supposed to we'll facilitate the Q&A. I have never used Hop-in before. I'm hoping that people in the audience can now raise their hand, signal that they'd like to jump in, and then that I will see that. I'm currently not seeing anybody. So if our panelists might have better insight on how this works than me. And I guess if we don't have questions, people jumping in from if our audience is shy, the panelists also could certainly ask questions of each other as well, which would be fantastic. So let's see.
Can I ask a question, Claire?
Sure. Is that Felix?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't see you, but that's wonderful. Yes.
Hi. I think so. In the chat, there are some questions, and it looks like there are some. It looks like there are some exchanges. I just had to follow up, Anthony. I just thought that your paper was really interesting. So I had a paper for Anthony in the chat that I was hoping to explore. It's just, and I think Anthony already answered it, but it's like in really thin markets, if you don't have that many people bidding, how do depreciating licenses work? The other thing I thought about was if, so I guess, what if you have licenses that are just term limited? So is it even though it's 100% of the right that's conveyed, is it 100% that's valued by the actual any takers or the owners themselves? I'm thinking, for instance, I think in China, there's like a 70-year term on property rights. And you would think that toward the end of that 70-year term, that the value begins to depreciate. But that's something that's quite different than what you're talking about, right? So I was wondering if that's roughly analogous at all.
Great question. So it's very analogous. And sort of, this is in a sense precisely the kind of issue we have with the term limit licenses is the non-stationarity, right? So imagine you own a fishery or something, or fishing rights for a piece of ocean, and you have a term limited license, right? Sort of when you have 70 years on it, it behaves basically like a full property license. You want to keep the fish alive, right? And then when you get to sort of 3 years left, sort of the license is worth very little, and sort of you thus have very little incentive to keep the fish alive. So you can really think of a depreciating license like a sort of continuously updated term limited license. Like rather than every 70 years you rebuy it, you rebuy kind of a small fraction of it every year, right? And so these are really like, that's really the core thing we're trying to push back against, which is that if you ever want to do a term limit, you can do something which kind of looks similar, but in a sense is smoother and doesn't have this cliff problem, right? Sort of, you never get to a point where the thing is worth zero because you're forced to repurchase depreciated pieces of the license sort of very frequently, right? Was that kind of the question you were?
I see. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. I actually had a question.
So I was actually also going to ask Faisal, because there's a whole bunch of questions in the chat, and if there was something that you wanted to elaborate on, I'm sure you've been reading them.
I just read Anthony's question. I feel like I kind of went on for quite a long time before, so maybe I'll step back and let others maybe chime in with anything they might have.
So Anthony, you were about to ask a question when I.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just gonna sort of basically say the question I said in chat, which is I wonder, in a world where we have crypto technologies, which I suppose let you, one way of viewing it is the cost of investing in an asset that is beyond the reach of any government to really regulate. Sort of the cost of privately producing very secure property is now pretty low. So I wonder if you try to deflate these sort of property bubbles and sort of destroy these sort of government sanctioned stores of value, is there ever a risk that all the value can try and sort of run into these sort of privately created stores of value and just inflate that? Yeah, sort of inflate that too.
So I put whatever answer I could think of or thought into the chat on that one. So a good question though, really interesting. Like the capital flight, mass capital flight into Bitcoin bubbles rather than whatever financial asset bubbles are we kind of currently subscribing.
Jump in with another comment for Nate, I guess because his paper is historical, that's and I'm a legal historian. It's something I feel like I can contribute to. So I'm looking at the your description of the argument of your book, which is so fascinating. And I just also wanted to, I'm looking at your comment, the argument of the book is less a normative case for use fix, but rather, and contra tax transfer, but rather recognizing as a descriptive matter how they've been posed as alternatives and as complements at different points in time, including today. You know, it's interesting, the historiography of the of sort of infrastructure development in the US has often been discussed as how in the US there were alternatives to actually using tax and transfer. We had, the federal government had such, was just getting, the customs revenue and basically didn't have high federal taxation. I mean, and I think part of that had to do with this sort of states' rights stuff that I think actually emanated out of slavery and everything, that the South was so hostile to taxation, and even the issues over the tariff with Calhoun and the states' rights arguments. But it's interesting. So if you think of some of the histories of development, going back to somebody like Marty Horowitz, actually, with the transformation of American law, he starts off by saying, how do we explain American development without taxation? And so, he's looking at judges and their property rights decisions as allocating property to the highest valued user, in a sense, the economically productive interest. But it's interesting how he frames it as a alternative to taxation. But there was the other school, which of Oscar and Marie Hanlon, who wrote this book Commonwealth, and Lewis Hartz, who wrote Economic Policy and Democratic Thought. They were actually all part of this group that was got together and decided to challenge the as laissez-faire. This is sort of after the New Deal. And a lot of that was, okay, in the absence of taxation, how do we explain why the US wasn't laissez-faire? And so they started looking at infrastructure. And again, it was often the conferral of charters and corporate charters. You probably know all this literature, but it's just, that the way infrastructure was built without doing tax and transfer was actually by giving these lots of corporate charters. In the case of this book, Hanlon's The Commonwealth is the name of the book, which is one of my favorite books. It's just fascinating as a way of stimulating people to invest in infrastructure. Lewis Hart's book is largely about the railroads, and it's the same, but it's the same sort of frame. Is again, how do we get the railroads without taxing and spending? And then again, it's sort of like you giving it describes this detailed process of giving these rights to railroad companies, and I think there's a little bit on canal building as well in that. But I just so I always call them the 4 H's. It's like Hanlon, Hartz, the Horowitz, and Hearst.
That's funny.
And it's just interesting that a lot of their frame is that. So I just thought of you with.
I mean, it makes me think of another H with Hartog and thinking about street building in New York and a similar sort of move. I mean, to the extent that there's this interest at the beginning of the Depression, Hoover is very interested in this, and the sort of people who are wanting to avoid the sort of taxation that would be necessary to solve the social problems of the Depression. Even as President-elect FDR said, maybe we should move 5 million people out of the cities. But because the frontier had closed, I mean, there was the thesis of, well, back when it was open, you could just send people out there and you wouldn't have to set up the sort of social infrastructure of a welfare state. But the problem was now, well, it has closed. There are rural landowners who you would need to take some of their land, and there were proposals for that. But in part, I think the reason that this didn't happen was there was rural resistance to, you know, you're going to take 10 acres of my land and give it to somebody else. But thank you. That's all super helpful. I appreciate it.
I asked Nate a question. I was also really interested in what you were saying about the sort of historical ebb and flow of the use fix. So I guess it brings to mind 2 things for me. One is maybe you get to this in the chapter. I think you didn't when I was reading it, but it brings to mind questions about 19th century tenancy legislation and the importance of the Irish land question and some of what's happening with tenancy legislation in other parts of the British Empire. So let's just comment. The question was, in thinking about the ebb and flow of it in the modern American city, or just the modern American consciousness, do you have any thoughts on how the notion of the tragedy of the commons plays into this? Because it seems like the tragedy of the commons idea, or Cossian ideas about sort of overuse-based externalities, has something to do with denigrating the commons and denigrating perhaps the use fix as, you know, a sort of the counter idea being no, like keep the property right more unified. So I'm just wondering where that, if you have a sense of where that would to the genealogy.
So to the extent the story I tell is grounded in Chicago and sort of people's interest in this as a way of, well, there's unused resources, there's unused land, and there's people who are not working, let's put them together, which is sort of the same instinct that Jefferson had when he was walking around in France and met this poor woman and saw all this land that wasn't being used. It's less about people, for the most part, weren't thinking about it in terms of the commons. They were thinking about it, if anything, in a sort of Georgist way, that this would be a helpful case study in why we should go down the road of the land value tax, which is a better option, but at least this sort of demonstration shows that we shouldn't be letting speculators allow things to lie slack. I mean, I think it's in part the sociologist in me that goes, the explanation I develop is it's very easy to start brokering deals between landowners who say, sure, fine, and a lot of them were sort of progressive firms that said, well, there's lots of things in the firm's interest to do this and to let people use the land. But then when it comes to actually making it permanent and figuring out an ownership structure that would make this land access permanent, that at that point it's sort of trying to shift a norm into a rule, and that there's no social movement that's developed. Part of my explanation is that because they were acting as brokers, the people who are promoting this were not acting as organizers and mobilizers. And so there was no sort of popular demand in the way that there's been popular demands for welfare rights that then can get them achieved and funded, but that this was a sort of different dynamic and a different mechanism.
Great. Felix or Vico, would you like to jump in with a question or final comment?
I'm good. Just thank you, Claire, and thank you to the fellow panelists and to Ramsey again.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I really don't have much to add at this point.
Well, if I can take non-moderators privilege organizer's privilege. In the 2 minutes that are remaining, I do have one question I've been wanting to put to Faisal, which is how do bubbles complicate this idea of land as sort of earning a scarcity rent? Because when in my mind's eye, I sort of see I see like a supply curve, right? And and it's sort of inelastic, and so that's where the scarcity rents come from. But then I see this sort of demand curve that's sort of jumping irrationally, due to sort of due to demand flowing into the system, and it makes me wonder. That seems to be a different world from one in which you've got this sort of static, rational demand, but the buyers are all sort of suffering because because of the nature of supply and what the sort of marginal price is. It seems to be different from one in which you've got people sort of voluntarily flowing into the market and bidding prices up. And it makes me wonder whether what's going on is not sort of the kind of pure rent extraction that we associate with land scarcity, but maybe something slightly different, as in for odd social reasons, we're choosing to use land value as a kind of medium through which we actually redistribute wealth, right? And so money flows into the property market, and middle-class homeowners, end up a little bit better off, perhaps, and the banks get a little bit better off, and then the identity of the owners changes, and so in a weird way, it's as if we turn the resource into a kind of lottery. So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I briefly saw that in the chat, and I started thinking about it. I don't know if I have a good answer to it, but I like the way you're conceptualizing that as an alternative to side of it. I guess I don't know if this is responsive, but maybe one thought it would bring up is an empirical one. Like, which are the moments we're thinking about as being the bubble-driven over-exuberance? I mean, obviously we're thinking about 2002 to 6 in the property market like that, but are we thinking about other moments in that upward ascent of the land price component? Do those map periods we think of as having been inside of real estate bubbles? I mean, I guess that would be an empirical question.
See, well, thank you very much for that. So we're now at time, and I just want to thank Claire, our moderator, and our 5 panelists for doing an amazing job and in really helping to clarify a lot of the issues.